The Fall of an Untouchable Voice, asterisk hook plus introduction, approximately 320 words asterisk. For years, Joe Rogan looked almost impossible to stop. His career kept evolving in ways few people ever do. First, he built a name in stand-up comedy. Then he became the unmistakable voice of the UFC. Finally, he transformed asterisk the Joe Rogan Experience asterisk into one of the biggest podcasts in the world, turning long-form conversations into one of the internet's most influential formats. With millions of listeners tuning in every episode and landmark deals reportedly worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Rogan reached a level of influence that traditional media could only dream about. At his peak, his audience often dwarfed the viewership of major television news networks. That success also gave him something few public figures ever experience: complete independence. Rogan openly embraced the freedom that came with it, whether it meant speaking his mind, choosing guests without outside pressure, or simply enjoying the lifestyle he had earned. For a long time, that confidence became part of his appeal. But success has a strange way of changing expectations. When someone becomes this influential, people stop judging them as a comedian or a podcast host. Instead, they begin judging them as someone capable of shaping public opinion. Over the past few years, many long-time listeners have argued that something changed. The conversations that once felt curious and unpredictable gradually began feeling more repetitive and more focused on politics and culture wars. At the same time, several public controversies added fuel to growing criticism, leaving Rogan facing questions from audiences that had once defended him without hesitation. More recently, even some of his own comments have sparked renewed debate, with critics arguing that his decisions and his responses to the backlash have only intensified the negative attention surrounding him. So how did one of the internet's most trusted voices become one of its most polarizing figures? The answer didn't happen overnight. According to many long-time observers, it unfolded through a series of turning points that slowly reshaped both Joe Rogan and the way millions of people viewed him. From curious host to cultural powerhouse, before the criticism, before the political debates, and before every episode became headline news. Asterisk the Joe Rogan Experience asterisk succeeded for one simple reason. Joe Rogan was curious. He didn't present himself as an expert. He was the guy asking questions, listening to people with completely different perspectives, and letting conversations unfold naturally. Whether the guest was a scientist, a comedian, an athlete, or a filmmaker, the show felt unpredictable, and that unpredictability became its greatest strength. As the audience grew, so did Rogan's influence. His podcast regularly attracted millions of listeners, far surpassing the audiences of many traditional media outlets. That enormous reach led Spotify to sign him to an exclusive deal reportedly worth around $100 million, with some reports suggesting the actual value was even higher. Later, Rogan revealed that Rumble also made a massive offer, but he chose to remain with Spotify because the company had stood by him during periods of intense public criticism. By that point, asterisk the Joe Rogan Experience asterisk wasn't just another podcast. It had become one of the most valuable media platforms in the world. Rogan understood exactly how valuable that platform was. He repeatedly explained that the show's success came from one principle: no one else decided who appeared on it. Every guest reflected his own curiosity, and he had no interest in giving anyone else control over that process. Not everyone loved the show, of course. For years, people joked about Rogan's habits, his fascination with elk hunting, kettlebells, psychedelics, or his famous line asking producer Jamie to pull up a video, but most of that criticism was playful. Even many fans laughed along because those quirks were part of the show's identity. Then something started to change. As Rogan's influence expanded, people began viewing him differently. He was no longer seen as just a comedian with a microphone. Increasingly, he was viewed as someone influencing national conversations. Around the same time, he became closely associated with a group of public intellectuals and commentators that came to be known as the *** intellectual dark web ***. Figures such as Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Eric Weinstein, and Dave Rubin frequently appeared on his podcast, building large audiences of their own. Rogan initially dismissed the label, insisting that he simply enjoyed talking with interesting people from different backgrounds. He also pointed out that many of his own positions support for same-sex marriage, marijuana legalization, abortion rights, and universal healthcare didn't fit neatly into a traditional conservative framework. Still, the label stuck. And according to many critics, that was the moment everything began to shift. For the first time, Joe Rogan wasn't just hosting conversations. Many people had started treating him as one of the people leading them. For years, one of Joe Rogan's greatest strengths was his willingness to admit what he didn't know. He often described himself as an average guy who happened to have access to fascinating people. That humility made guests feel comfortable, and it made listeners feel like they were learning alongside him. But as his influence continued to grow, many critics believe something changed. Being repeatedly described as one of the internet's most important voices and as a central figure in a growing intellectual movement may have gradually altered the way he approached conversations. Instead of asking questions, critics argue that Rogan increasingly began answering them. Long-time listeners noticed that episodes often returned to the same familiar topics, regardless of who was sitting across the table. Political debates, culture wars, social media, and government institutions began appearing in conversations that once would have gone in completely different directions. Some viewers felt that guests were being interrupted more often, while others argued that Rogan spent more time reinforcing his own viewpoints than exploring those of the people he invited. One interview that drew particular attention was his conversation with former Navy SEAL Sean Ryan. Rather than allowing Ryan's experiences to guide the discussion, many viewers felt the conversation repeatedly shifted back toward Rogan's own observations and opinions. Comments from longtime fans reflected a growing frustration. Many argued that the podcast no longer felt like an open-ended discussion. Instead, it increasingly resembled a platform where certain talking points surfaced again and again, no matter the guest. At the same time, another criticism began gaining traction. As the Joe Rogan Experience became one of the world's most influential media platforms, the choice of guests carried more weight than ever before. Some listeners questioned why certain controversial figures appeared on the show with relatively little pushback, while other high-profile voices, particularly those who strongly disagreed with Rogan, never received the same opportunity. California Governor Gavin Newsom, for example, publicly challenged Rogan to host a conversation. Newsom repeatedly suggested he was willing to appear on the podcast, while Rogan openly expressed little interest, describing him more as an interesting political case study than someone he wanted to interview. To many longtime followers, that felt different from the Joe Rogan they remembered. Years earlier, Rogan had built his reputation by inviting people with opposing views and allowing difficult conversations to happen in front of millions of listeners. Whether discussing abortion, free speech, or other divisive topics, he rarely seemed afraid of disagreement. Now, critics argued that the podcast was becoming less unpredictable and more selective. Whether that perception was entirely fair or not, it marked another turning point in Rogan's public image. The podcast that had once built its reputation on curiosity was now being judged by an entirely different standard, and that was only the beginning. The next chapter would prove even more controversial, as Joe Rogan's influence moved beyond podcasting and into national politics. When podcasting entered politics, for most of its history, the Joe Rogan Experience existed in a space that felt separate from traditional politics. Political guests certainly appeared on the show, but they were only part of a much larger mix of comedians, scientists, athletes, authors, and entertainers. That variety was one of the reasons the podcast appealed to such a broad audience. Over time, however, many listeners felt the balance began to shift. Political discussions became more frequent, culture war topics occupied more airtime, and every major episode seemed to generate headlines beyond the podcast world. Then came the 2020 presidential election. As the campaign intensified, both Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris became part of the conversation surrounding the show. Trump appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience while Harris ultimately did not. Shortly afterward, Rogan publicly endorsed Donald Trump. The endorsement immediately became national news, not because celebrities had never endorsed candidates before, but because Rogan's audience was so massive that many viewed his support as politically significant. Explaining his decision, Rogan argued that repeated misinformation and media narratives surrounding the Democratic Party had convinced him that something was fundamentally wrong. In conversations with Elon Musk, he expressed frustration over what he believed were repeated political hoaxes and media distortions. The endorsement divided his audience almost instantly. Some praised him for speaking openly about his beliefs. Others questioned whether a comedian and podcast host should use such an influential platform to encourage millions of listeners toward a particular candidate. Even people who had agreed with Rogan on many issues admitted they were surprised by the decision. Some argued that the host they once admired for asking difficult questions now appeared to be taking sides in a way that fundamentally changed the identity of the show. Several fellow comedians also voiced concerns. Without directly attacking Rogan personally, some warned that influential podcasts carried enormous responsibility, especially when interviewing political figures or discussing highly polarizing subjects. Their concern wasn't simply about who appeared on these shows, but about the growing influence these conversations could have on public opinion. Then, another twist followed. After the election, Rogan began criticizing aspects of the administration's immigration enforcement, particularly scenes involving long-term undocumented residents being detained in front of their families. He argued that while border security remained important, enforcement also needed compassion for people who had spent decades working, raising families, and contributing to their communities. To some observers, those comments reflected consistency with views Rogan had expressed years earlier. To others, they suggested that he was beginning to question the real-world consequences of policies he had supported during the campaign. Regardless of which interpretation was correct, one thing was clear. Joe Rogan had become far more than a podcast host. His opinions were now treated as political events. And once that happened, every word carried consequences that stretched far beyond his studio. The comedy empire starts to crack long before podcasting made him one of the most influential voices on the internet. Joe Rogan saw himself as a stand-up comedian first. Comedy wasn't just part of his career, it was the foundation of it. After moving to Austin, Texas, Rogan invested heavily in that passion by opening **** Comedy Mothership ***, a club built around his vision of creating a new home for stand-up. Top comedians quickly began performing there, and for a while, the venue was celebrated as one of the most exciting comedy clubs in America. On paper, everything looked like another success. But outside the club, a different conversation was beginning to take shape. For years, Rogan's own stand-up had divided audiences. While many respected his work ethic and influence within comedy, others argued that his greatest talent wasn't performing on stage, it was discovering and promoting other comedians. As Comedy Mothership became the center of Austin's growing comedy scene, critics began claiming that the culture surrounding the club was becoming increasingly predictable. Instead of celebrating originality, they argued that many performers were relying on the same controversial subjects night after night. Material centered on culture war issues, identity politics, and provocative language became so common that even fellow comedians started questioning whether shock value had replaced strong writing. Some comics who visited Austin openly admitted that the atmosphere wasn't for them. Others joked about the city developing its own comedy bubble, where everyone seemed to share the same perspective and reinforce the same ideas. Even comedians who respected Rogan personally suggested that the scene had become too insulated. According to these critics, the problem wasn't that controversial topics were off limits. It was that repeating the same themes over and over no longer felt bold, it felt expected. Audience reactions reflected a similar concern. Some visitors described shows where nearly every performer leaned into the same style of material, leaving little variety throughout the night. Rather than pushing comedy in new directions, critics argued that the performances often revolved around familiar talking points. The criticism didn't stop with the club itself. Several comedians closely associated with Rogan also faced growing scrutiny. When Bryan Callen released a new comedy special, expectations were high, especially with support from Rogan and the Austin comedy community. The response, however, fell well short of what many had anticipated. The special struggled to gain momentum online, leading Callen to publicly reflect on whether stand-up specials still carried the same cultural impact they once did. Others saw the disappointing numbers differently, arguing that simply being connected to Rogan's circle was no longer enough to guarantee success. Meanwhile, comedians like Andrew Santino made it clear they preferred building their careers outside Austin's rapidly growing comedy ecosystem, while others, including Shane Gillis and Matt McCusker, poked fun at what they jokingly called the comedy wars. Even longtime comedian Mark Maron openly criticized what he believed Rogan's influence had done to modern stand-up, arguing that comedy had become increasingly tribal and divided. Whether those criticisms were fair remains a matter of opinion, but together they pointed toward a larger shift. The influence that once seemed unstoppable was no longer unquestioned. For the first time in years, people weren't just debating Joe Rogan's podcast. They were beginning to question the legacy he was building across comedy itself. The price of becoming too big today, Joe Rogan remains one of the biggest names in podcasting. Millions of people still listen to the Joe Rogan Experience and his influence is something most creators can only imagine. Declaring his career over would simply ignore reality. But staying relevant isn't the same as remaining untouchable. In recent years, Rogan has faced growing criticism over several public comments, including discussions about public health and vaccines. Some of those remarks drew sharp responses from medical professionals and commentators, who argued that parts of his commentary were inaccurate or lacked important context. At the same time, industry reports suggested that the Joe Rogan Experience was no longer dominating podcast rankings as consistently as it once had. Other shows began challenging and, in some cases, surpassing its performance on certain charts. While Rogan still commands an enormous audience, many observers believe the gap between him and the rest of the podcast world has narrowed. Taken individually, none of these developments would define his legacy. Together, however, they paint a different picture. The criticism surrounding Joe Rogan isn't only about politics. It isn't only about comedy, and it isn't only about the guests he chooses to interview. At its core, many long-time listeners believe it's about something much simpler. They miss the version of Joe Rogan who seemed genuinely curious, the host who openly admitted when he didn't know something, the comedian who invited people with radically different perspectives simply because he wanted to understand how they saw the world. As his platform grew, so did the expectations placed upon him. Some believe he embraced that responsibility. Others believe he gradually started seeing himself as more than a host. Whether that perception is fair depends on who you ask, but perception often shapes public opinion just as much as reality. Ironically, the quality that helped Joe Rogan build one of the largest audiences in podcast history wasn't certainty, it was uncertainty. People tuned in because they watched someone explore ideas in real time, not because they expected him to have all the answers. When a host begins sounding more certain than curious, the experience inevitably changes. That doesn't mean Joe Rogan has lost everything. Far from it, his audience remains enormous, his influence is undeniable, and his place in modern media is already secure. The real question isn't whether Joe Rogan can stay successful. It's whether he can reconnect with the qualities that made millions of people trust him in the first place. Because history has shown that audiences rarely abandon success. They abandon authenticity when they feel it's been replaced. And for one of the most influential voices of the podcast era, that may be the greatest challenge still ahead.